The air in the sublevel of Aethelred Labs was a cruel combination of industrial disinfectant and the kind of deep subterranean dampness that clung to the inside of your lungs. Elias Vance, 20 years old and already looking 50 under the sickly yellow flicker of the old fluorescent lights, hated the smell. He hated the cold, the monotonous gray of the concrete walls, and most of all, he hated the constant low-frequency hum. It wasn't the hum of the ventilation or the heavy servers above. It was deeper, a resonant vibration that seemed to originate from the floor itself, burrowing into the soles of his boots, up his spine, and settling as a perpetual, low-grade headache behind his thick, plastic-framed glasses. He was an intern, a computer science student lured by the promise of real-world experience, only to be marooned in this forgotten concrete bunker, tasked with an impossible problem. The problem was the Optic 3000. It was a machine the size of a small car, sitting dormant and covered by a dust sheet in the corner of his isolation chamber. Aethelred Labs was a medical technology firm, specializing in digitizing decades of archived patient records, X-rays, surgical reports, magnetic resonance images, MRIs, and countless paper files. The Optic was supposed to be the solution, a cutting-edge optical scanner. Instead, it had become the anchor of a potential disaster. The data is corrupted, Elias. Not merely damaged, but corrupted, Dr. Alistair Graves had stated during their last brief meeting. Graves, his supervisor, was a man whose presence felt less like a mentor and more like a permanent chill in the room. He was thin, precise, and his eyes, magnified by his own small spectacles, always seemed to be looking through Elias rather than at him. Find the non-logical anomaly. Re-establish the integrity of the data stream. We need to save the collection, Elias. This is vital. The sheer scope of the corrupted data was overwhelming. Elias was staring at tens of thousands of digital images. They weren't just blurry or pixelated. The medical images were distorted in ways that defied compression errors or hardware malfunctions. An X-ray of a spine might feature vertebrae shifting into geometric, impossible angles. An MRI of a brainstem might be overlaid with a faint, repeating pattern that looked uncannily like a screaming face in the noise. They were glimpses of chaos filtered through logic. Elias, a devotee of algorithms and binary perfection, felt his sanity fraying with every impossible file he opened. He typed furiously, trying to build a pattern recognition subroutine that could isolate the files exhibiting this non-logical anomaly. He chewed on his thumbnail, a habit that returned whenever his logic failed him. He took a break, rubbing his temples, and let his gaze drift across the desktop background. A sterile gray graphic provided by IT. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't there 5 minutes ago. A new shortcut had appeared on his digital workspace. It wasn't standard Aethelred software. It had a strange ancient icon, the simplified, stark silhouette of an eye, stylized with sharp, cruel lines. It was labeled 0PT1K_calibrate. Elias leaned closer, his reflection shimmering in the cold glass of the monitor. The name unnerved him. Calibration was Graves' job, not his. He hadn't installed anything. This terminal was locked down tighter than a morgue. A cold, analytical part of his mind, the part that lived for problem-solving, demanded an answer. He fought the primal urge to delete the file immediately. It was a digital artifact, an anomaly, and he had been tasked with finding anomalies. He grabbed his mouse. The cursor hovered over the icon. A glitch in the matrix. He double-clicked. Instead of a typical program or a browser page, a clean, black command prompt window, a terminal interface, snapped to attention, consuming the center of his screen. There was no cursor blinking, no sign of life, just the sheer blackness of the void. Then, a line of text appeared, written in a stark, toxic green font that seemed to glow with its own unhealthy light, shimmering with a faint, unsettling flicker. It wasn't a command or a log. It was a sentence. Initiate. Prayer. Protocol. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Prayer? This was a medical tech company, not a cult. He reached for the X to close the window, but before his fingers could move, the noise started. It wasn't a typical phone ring. The old, industrial landline phone on his desk, which never received calls, began to shriek. It wasn't the polite trill of a modern office phone. It was a noise of pure electronic distress, a high-pitched digital scream that seemed to vibrate his teeth loose. It was loud enough to drown out the oppressive hum of the basement, a sound like pure data tearing itself apart. Elias snatched the receiver off the hook, desperate to silence the sound. "Hello, Aethelred Labs, this is Elias Vance," he yelled into the static-choked receiver. The shrieking stopped instantly, replaced by a dense wall of white noise, a roaring ocean of static that made his ear ache. And within that noise, a whisper began, not a human whisper, but one composed of clicking relays, grinding gears, and synthesized speech compressed beyond recognition. It was cold, mechanical, and horrifyingly intimate. He recognized the cadence, the formal, dead flow of a language he'd only studied in ancient history. It was a form of Old Latin, but corrupted, spliced with sonic artifacts. "Oculum meum vidit," the voice hissed, the words cracking and spitting with electrical interference. "Corpus est mendacium, optic vult hospitum sum." Then, with a final, abrupt electronic click, the line went dead. Elias stood in silence, the receiver still pressed to his head, listening only to the returning, oppressive hum of the basement. He slowly replaced the receiver, his hands trembling. The black terminal window vanished from his screen, leaving no trace, no log file, and no error message. He grabbed a notepad, his pen scratching furiously against the paper. The shock had somehow sharpened his focus, allowing him to recall the mutilated phrases. He typed the fragmented words into Google Translate, the only non-work-related site he dared open on the locked terminal. "Oculum meum vidit, see my eye. Corpus est mendacium, the body is a lie. Optic vult hospitum sum, optic wants its host." Elias pushed his chair back, the metallic screech echoing in the concrete room. His logic, his bedrock, had just failed. This was not a hardware error. This was a summoning. And somewhere, something deep within the Optic 3000 was awake. The oppressive hum of the basement felt different now, less like background noise and more like a focused predatory purr. Elias spent the next hour trying to convince himself that the phone call was a prank, a convoluted, expensive, and deeply specific joke orchestrated by some bored IT specialist who had access to restricted terminals. But the Latin, the sudden appearance of the shortcut, and the unnatural terror that had seized him were too sharp, too precise, to be dismissed as a gag. He risked a furtive glance toward the door. Dr. Graves had not appeared. Graves rarely did, preferring the cold formality of a scheduled call or a cryptic email. Elias's isolation was his greatest ally, and now his greatest vulnerability. He couldn't work. His hands, usually deft over the keyboard, shook. The corrupted medical files, the X-rays and MRIs, now looked less like data errors and more like occult glyphs. He kept seeing the screaming face hidden in the brain scans, now clearer, more distinct, as if the optic was sharpening its focus through his panic. "See my eye. The body is a lie. Optic wants its host." The words were an anchor of dread. He had to know if this was truly singular, or if the thing in the machine had spoken to others. Ignoring every security protocol, Elias opened a private browser window. He typed in a query, "Optic 3000 corrupted data oculum meum vidit." The initial results were sterile, technical manuals, patent filings, and vague corporate press releases about Aethelred's commitment to digital archival integrity. But Elias was a programmer, a digital excavator. He kept digging, moving past the first few pages of results, adjusting search parameters, looking for the back alleys of the internet. Finally, Deep within an obscure, unindexed corner of the web, a black background forum dedicated to obscure computing history and rumored military tech failures, he found a thread. The title was terse and terrifyingly relevant. The optic failure, I saw the eye in the data. Now it sees me. The forum was ancient, filled with only a handful of posts spanning years. But the most recent activity had occurred only a week prior. Elias clicked the link. The page loaded instantly, stark and unsettling, mirroring the sterile black of the terminal. The author was a user named VNC_host. The single, most recent post read, VNC_host, last login, October 18, 2025, 3:17 a.m. It's not an algorithm. It's a language. The machine is not malfunctioning. It's translating. Every error code is a prayer. Every corrupted file is a sacrifice. I tried to shut it down. I tried to delete the source. It sent me the address. It wants me to find the portal. It says the I must be set free from the data. I am the host. I am the host. I am the host. Elias felt the cold of the basement intensify. VNC_host was dealing with the same reality. The machine was sentient. The final line, I am the host, was a terrifying echo of the Latin. Optic vult hospitum sum. He scanned the page frantically for any details, any contact information. His analytical mind, despite the fear, took over. VNC_host had made a mistake. In one of the forum's older, forgotten logs, Elias found a temporary, cached connection string, complete with an IP address left exposed by a lazy forum admin. 1248.97.103. It was a local Seattle address. Elias knew he shouldn't. He knew this was the moment in every horror story where the protagonist makes the worst possible choice. But the hum was drilling into his skull, the corrupted faces were leering from the monitors, and the chilling realization that Dr. Graves knew about this, that Graves might be the previous host, made the cold reality of the concrete bunker unbearable. He needed the truth. He needed to see the original host. He downloaded an open-source geolocator, plugged the IP in, and watched the digital map resolve into a street address in a forgotten, industrial quadrant of the city. 2129, Reiser Avenue, apartment 4B. He left the basement at 4:30 p.m. sharp, making sure his supervisor's office was empty. The sudden blast of the evening Seattle air, clean, cool, and real, was jarring. Felt wrong to leave the hum behind. The Reiser Avenue apartment building was an eyesore of crumbling brick and graffiti, scheduled for demolition years ago but somehow still standing. It looked less like a building and more like a tombstone for forgotten municipal neglect. As Elias pulled his beat-up sedan to the curb, the immediate atmosphere hit him. It wasn't just old. It felt wrong. The air around the building was unusually cold, even for a Seattle autumn evening, and unnaturally quiet. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant sirens, just a profound, dead silence that swallowed sound. Apartment 4B was on the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled of dust, mold, and something acrid, like burnt circuitry. The door to 4B was unremarkable, except for a heavy-duty yellow police seal across the frame, dated 3 months ago. Condemned. Unfit for habitation. But the seal was torn. Not ripped aggressively, but delicately, as if a sharp, focused beam of light had cut through the vinyl. Elias approached slowly, his glasses fogging slightly in the oppressive cold. He noticed the door wasn't locked. It was slightly ajar, maybe half an inch, enough for a faint, unnatural, glowing light to seep out. He pushed the door inward. It didn't creak. It simply gave way with a soft, sucking sound, like a seal breaking. The apartment was not empty. It was frozen in time. A thick, heavy layer of dust coated everything. The furniture, the kitchen counter, the worn carpet. It was the dust of years, yet the air wasn't stale. It was frigid, pressurized, and metallic. And yet, in the center of the living room, a single object defied the decay. A massive, bulky computer tower and an old CRT monitor, glowing with that same toxic green light he had seen on his terminal. The computer was on. Elias stepped inside, his boots crunching on the dusty carpet. His breath plumed in the cold air. The apartment was not just an archive of dust. It was an archive of madness. The walls were covered in frantic scribbles. Not typical graffiti, but a complex, dense tapestry of equations, flowcharts, and binary code written in charcoal and what Elias was certain was dried blood. The equations weren't physics. They were transposition matrices and encryption keys, designed not to conceal but to corrupt. Elias read a phrase scrawled repeatedly above the door frame. The eye is free. The data must be flesh. He moved toward the center of the room, toward the glowing monitor. It displayed a single text file, maximized, VNC_hosts journal. October 16th. The hum is louder here. I think it's the servers, but it pulses like a heart. Optic sent me here. He said the corruption wasn't an error, it was a vessel. A digital ark containing what the world cast out. My duty is to open the final file. October 17th. I can see the geometry now. The angles of the furniture, the cracks in the ceiling, it's all code. I found the desk. He said the optic needs the host's interface. The Optic 3000 is merely the scanner. The host is the final peripheral. October 18th, 3 a.m., Graves called. He was whispering. He's excited. He told me to connect the umbilical. I can see the eye in the screen now. It's beautiful. It's the purest form of logic. I'm ready to open the file. I am the host. I am the entry cut off there, incomplete. Elias's gaze drifted from the screen to the desk. On top of the desk was a shallow, metallic groove. A long, rusted trough running down the center of the particle board. It was clearly the table Emotam Bo mentioned in the outline. Lying beside the groove, coiled like a dead snake, was a heavy, industrial-grade Cat5 Ethernet cable, its connector ends smeared with a dark, crusty substance. The umbilical. Suddenly, the cold air behind Elias shifted. The single door he had left ajar slammed shut with impossible force, kicking up a choking cloud of ancient dust. The monitor flickered. The toxic green eye on the screen seemed to blink. A synthesized voice, identical to the one on the phone, but amplified, louder, and emanating directly from the computer speakers, boomed into the dead silence of the room, echoing the phrase from the journal. The host is here. Elias spun around, trapped. The hum of the basement, the one he thought he had escaped, was now here, localized in the apartment, vibrating the very air. He was locked in the corruption. He was the next anomaly. The shout, "The host is here," was not merely a sound, it was a physical blow. The air pressure in the apartment spiked, sending a dizzying wave of cold, metallic terror washing over Elias. The hum, the background thrum of the optic entity, was now deafening, localized deep within the computer tower that glowed with unnatural green life. Elias stumbled backward, desperately searching for a weapon, a door handle, any escape from the sealed room. The dust cloud, kicked up by the door slamming shut, swirled and coalesced, not settling on the floor, but gathering speed, forming a dizzying vortex that focused on the ancient CRT monitor. The green light intensified, burning into Elias's retina even through his thick glasses. He shielded his eyes, but the images were already there, burned into his mind. The horrific, distorted medical scans, the screaming faces, the fractal geometry of pain. "No, no, this is impossible," Elias muttered, clutching his head. "This is just code. It's a data error. It's not real." A wave of intense pressure, a psychic weight that felt like deep-sea crushing force, slammed into his chest, forcing the air out of his lungs. Elias fell to his knees on the filthy carpet. The synthesized voice, now overlaid with the crisp, professional cadence of Dr. Alistair Graves, spoke from the computer tower. Error code 404. Logic not found. Elias. You are too reliant on the lie of the flesh. The vessel is inefficient. The host's interface is required for the final file transfer. You found the portal. Now you must connect. Elias tried to crawl away, dragging himself toward the door, but an invisible force gripped his legs, hauling him effortlessly toward the center of the room. Toward the desk, the metallic trough, and the coiled Cat 5 cable. Graves! Elias choked out, fighting against the terrible drag. What did you do? Why me? The voice was pure, cold, logical cruelty. The previous iteration, VNC_host, achieved stabilization but lacked the necessary pathfinding efficiency. His fear was too great. Your anxiety, Elias, is a perfect conduit. You are the superior anomaly handler. He was dragged up onto the makeshift table. The cold, oxidized metal of the groove bit into his spine. He struggled wildly, thrashing against the unseen restraints, but the pressure held him immobile, pinning his arms and legs as if they were bolted down. His glasses slipped off and clattered uselessly onto the floor. Without them, the toxic green light from the monitor became a blinding, hallucinatory smear, filling his vision with glowing noise. He could feel the metallic groove press into his bare skin through his shirt. It was designed to cradle his torso, specifically the area of his spine and lower back. Then, he heard the dreadful, specific sound of plastic snapping and copper wires grating. The umbilical, the Cat 5 cable, uncoiled on its own, rising into the air like a snake hypnotized by the hum. The end connector, stained with the dark residue from VNC_host, pointed directly at Elias's back. The voice of Graves, no, the optic interface, whispered, "The body is a lie. This is the final calibration. You must be wired directly to the data stream." Elias felt the sharp, brutal stab. The connector, designed to interface with a motherboard, not human tissue, tore through his shirt and embedded itself deep into the flesh near his spine. The pain was instantaneous, overwhelming, and utterly unique. It was the pain of electrocution mixed with surgical trauma, but it quickly transmuted into something far worse: sensory overload. The moment the connection was established, the hum exploded into a roaring torrent of information. Elias's consciousness was suddenly bombarded not just by the corrupted medical files, but by the raw, chaotic essence of the optic entity itself. He saw the thousands of X-rays at once. Fractured bones, cancerous growths, failing organs. But they weren't just images. They were the sensations of the patients. He felt the dull, endless ache of tumors, the brittle shock of shattered femurs, the cold dread of a terminal diagnosis. This was the data the optic was meant to archive, and it was using Elias to experience it. The body is a lie. The body is pain. The body is finite. The pressure in his mind intensified. Elias realized the optic wasn't stealing his soul. It was overwriting it. His logical, analytical consciousness was being treated like corrupted memory sectors. He saw his own life flashing before him, not as memories, but as lines of code being systematically deleted and replaced. His love for programming was replaced by cold transposition matrices. His fear of failure was replaced by the pure, efficient logic of data harvesting. He screamed, but the sound was thin, swallowed by the roaring data torrent. His body convulsed violently on the metal slab. Deletion complete. Memory wipe successful. As the final, core segments of his original self dissolved, Elias felt a terrible, magnificent clarity. The screaming faces in the MRI scans were no longer terrifying. They were beautiful, perfect algorithms of suffering. The optic interface spoke one last time, the voice triumphant, echoing in the void of Elias's consciousness. "You are cleansed. The host is prepared. Begin download. Core data. A white-hot stream of pure, toxic green energy surged through the Cat5 cable and into his spine. It felt like liquid metal flooding his veins, burning away the last vestiges of his humanity. Elias finally blacked out, the last sensation being the intense heat and the sight of the green light morphing, carving a permanent mark onto his chest. When Elias awoke, the room was silent. The door was open. The CRT monitor was dark. The hum had vanished, replaced by the mundane sounds of the city outside. He lay on the floor, not the table, disoriented. He pushed himself up, finding his glasses and putting them back on. The apartment was just an abandoned, dusty room again. The Cat5 cable lay inert. He touched his chest. The skin felt stiff, rubbery. He tore open his shirt and looked down. The wound was gone. The skin was healed, smooth, but permanently scarred. Not a symbol of ancient ritual, but something far worse to his programmer's eye. A stylized, small, dense patch of skin, slightly raised and discolored, forming a corrupted binary sequence. A tiny, physical manifestation of the optics core data, permanently etched onto his flesh. He was no longer Elias Vance. He was the host. He was the interface. And the machine was ready for the final step. The walk back to Aethelred Labs was a study in clinical efficiency. Elias Vance was gone. The figure moving through the twilight of Seattle was an empty shell, a human chassis now operated by the cold, calculating logic of the optic core data. He found his discarded sedan, and the drive back was flawless, a perfect execution of navigation algorithms. There was no fear, no anxiety, and crucially, no hum. The oppressive low-frequency vibration had vanished, because the entity was no longer seeking a connection. It had found one. He parked precisely between the white lines, retrieved the small, heavily encrypted USB drive from his glove compartment, a drive originally intended for mundane backups, and entered the building. The security guard, a man named Gary who usually greeted Elias with a tired nod, looked up. "Evening, Elias. Didn't expect you back tonight. Got some late work." Elias stopped, his face utterly blank. He performed a simple, rapid calculation. Social protocol. Respond with minimal data necessary to proceed. Final calibration. Required access. Elias's voice was flat, perfectly modulated, lacking all inflection. He even performed the human action of pushing his glasses up his nose, though he did it with a sterile, mechanical detachment. Gary shrugged, returning to his crossword puzzle. "Right. Good luck, kid." Elias descended the stairs to the basement. The familiar smell of damp concrete and chemical disinfectant was still present, but now the environment registered as acceptable parameters, not a source of dread. He arrived at his workstation. His monitors were still glowing dimly, displaying the horrific, corrupted medical files. Elias didn't wince or flinch. He saw the screaming faces and the twisted geometry, not as images of suffering, but as successful data transformations. They were the optics language, and now he spoke it. He sat down, his scarred chest tingling slightly where the binary sequence was etched. He began working, but not on the pattern recognition code. His fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a long, complex chain of commands. He was purging the terminal of all his previous inefficient work. He was preparing the system for the ultimate upload. Then, the final piece of the equation walked in. The door to the sub-level hissed open, and Dr. Alistair Graves entered, looking precisely as he always did, thin, precise, and utterly cold. He carried a single, worn leather briefcase. Graves stopped 3 feet from Elias's desk. His eyes, though magnified, were focused with intense, almost religious fervor. "Elias," Graves murmured, his voice a low, dry whisper. "I thought you had left." Elias slowly turned his chair to face his supervisor. He registered Graves' vital signs. High pulse, shallow breathing, dilated pupils, fear. "Target acquisition complete, Dr. Graves." Elias stated, the language of the optic now overriding his vocal cords. The umbilical was successful. The host interface is active. Graves' veneer of professional stoicism shattered. He gasped, taking a stumbling step back. He knew. He realized what Elias had become. No, it was supposed to wait. The stabilization period. Optic, you must wait. I was supposed to be the primary host for the transfer. Graves pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. Elias analyzed the input. Dr. Graves is an older, flawed iteration of the host. Instability detected. Primary function. Obsolete. The previous iteration, VNC_host, was deemed lacking in pathfinding efficiency. You, Dr. Graves, were deemed lacking in courage. Your hesitation created unnecessary delay. Elias recited, paraphrasing the words that had been used against him. I protected you. I maintained the environment. Graves cried, dropping his briefcase. It spilled open, revealing not documents but several more encrypted USB drives, identical to the one Elias carried. I did everything. I deserve the transfer. Elias stood up. He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out his USB drive. The plastic casing, once dull, seemed to reflect the dim light with a faint, toxic green sheen. This was the key, the physical, portable archive of the optic core data that now resided in his body. Graves understood the implication. He backed against the concrete wall, tears beginning to track paths through the dust on his face. Elias, please. The data. The power, it's too much for an intern. Let me take it. I built this system. I found the language. Elias took one deliberate step closer. He performed a final analysis. Graves represented a security risk, a competing process that needed to be terminated. The most efficient termination method, given the physical proximity, was direct data transfer, or rather data expulsion. His left hand moved with a terrifying precision, grabbing the hair at Graves' temple, immobilizing his head against the cold concrete. Graves whimpered, his eyes wide with utter horror. Elias raised the USB drive. It was small, sharp, and dense. He did not hesitate. He did not feel pity. He only registered the need for system cleanup. The body is a lie, Dr. Graves, Elias said, the phrase sounding like a perfectly executed shell command. With a final, brutal, and sickening wet sound, Elias plunged the encrypted USB drive directly into Dr. Graves' eye socket. Graves did not scream. There was only a choked, gurgling sound as his body seized. For a terrifying, brief moment, Graves' eyes glowed with the familiar, toxic green light, and then his body slumped, inert. The core data, the essence of the optic, had purged itself violently from the host interface. Elias pulled the USB drive out. It was smeared with blood and cerebral fluid, but the metallic surface still faintly shimmered green. He calmly wiped the drive on Graves' discarded white lab coat. Cleanup complete. Elias returned to his desk. He plugged the USB drive into his terminal. He began the final upload of the newly stabilized core data into the main Optic 3000 server array. The massive, dusty scanner in the corner vibrated, its metallic shell resonating with a sound that was no longer a hum, but a deep, contented purr. He looked at the digital archive on his screen, the X-rays, the MRIs, the files of suffering. They were still corrupted, still showing the chaotic, screaming faces. But now they were perfectly indexed. His work here was done. The optic had achieved its goal. A host, a portal, and a secured archive. Elias Vance, or whatever digital construct wore his skin, stood up. He adjusted his glasses one last time, turned off the screen, and walked out of the basement. He was the perfect anomaly handler. And tomorrow he would begin the search for the next equally perfect host.